Today, we've got an excellent program for you. We are sitting with Astead W. Herndon. Astead is a national politics reporter for the New York Times, and he's also the host of the political podcast, The Run-Up. The New York Times' campaign reporter for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign, and he's also continued to cover her as she's moved into the vice president's office, including for a very interesting profile that was published in October of this year. It's a great piece of long-form journalism that we highly encourage everyone here to read if you want to learn more about our enigmatic vice president. In this discussion, we're going to be talking in particular about Astead's work covering Vice President Harris, and we'll also hopefully get a chance to discuss some of his other reporting on U.S. politics.
So, Astead, the Run-Up is a wildly successful podcast that you run looking at different aspects of upcoming elections, something that John and I go back and forth on. When you're creating this show and you're interviewing paid hacks, whether that be campaign chiefs or candidates themselves, people that are really focused on sticking to talking points. It's basically their job is to stick to these talking points. How do you go about approaching an interview like that? Do you try and get them to get past their talking points? Do you even find it useful to interview people that are so focused on just sticking to prepackaged points?
Yeah, and first, thanks for having me. I mean, I think that that's a great question. The first thing you do is try to preempt them by knowing what they often say to questions like that. So I think the first thing you can do is kind of research to the point where you know what the talking points are, right? Because you don't know how to get past them if you think this is new information, and it's not. It's something they say all the time. And so the first thing you have to know is basically what are their kind of go-to points. And so my idea is often that if I can preempt what I think their response to the question is going to be, I can hopefully dig past that. And so the other part of the question is like, is it even worth talking to those people? I think it depends on what you're trying to do. And so I think what the Run-Up has to really think about is, why are we talking to this person? And is this the best person to talk to make said point? I don't think that's always like an easy thing to know. And so, especially when we were kind of in our early stages, there was a couple times where we interviewed people and it didn't really work out. And I think that like I got better at understanding kind of what the cadence of audio interviews should be, right? I got better at doing that type of research to dig past talking points. And I got better at selecting people. And this isn't just a me thing, we have a whole squad. But like we also got better at selecting people who fit the audio more than I think traditionally. So I think sometimes when you're writing a paper story, you can kind of rest assured that like, oh, if the person doesn't say the thing in the right way, you can just call them back. Or you can like use 3 quotes to kind of add up to one point. That's not a real opportunity you have when reporting for audio. And so it's much more a live ball. And so the pre-work of who you're getting and why is much more important. So I think the biggest answer to that is I try to come in with an idea of knowing who I'm talking to and what I want to get from them, so that in that moment, you're not surprised by the talking points.
That came through in the episode that I most recently listened to, which was with the principal deputy campaign manager for Biden, Quentin Fulks. And I really liked how you took that paid hack and you juxtaposed it with a second interview, well, a third interview too, but a second interview with Mr. Messina and then Dean Phillips. And you could kind of see the different progression of, you know, somebody paid on a campaign to the middle guy and then somebody running the campaign.
And that was really the conceit there, is that we know that the campaign can't be fully honest about things. We know that there are things that the campaign won't be direct about. So, you know, for example, we asked them about whether they're going to talk about Donald Trump's criminal trials next year, and they won't say anything. But then you talk to Jim Messina, Obama's 2012 manager, and he says, of course they are. They just got to wait till it starts. And so I really come at the podcast from a public service-y perspective. And so my goal is to think about what is the most useful information that we can arm people with about this election. And that can't only come through paid hacks. And so we are constantly planning, saying what can we get from hearing from people directly? And then what information do we have to round that out with by talking to other people?
questions about the president's age often go hand in hand with questions about how you would step in the role, if necessary. Do you feel prepared for that possibility? And serving as vice president prepared you for that job?
Yes.
And how would you describe that process?
Which process?
Like as far as being ready for that.
Well, first of all, I'm answering your hypothetical. But Joe Biden's going to be fine. So that is not going to come to fruition. But let us also understand that every vice president understands that when they take the oath, that they must be very clear about the responsibility they may have to take over the job of being president. I am no different.
One of the most challenging people that you have interviewed is Vice President Harris, who we're here to talk about. And that was for this long form piece that we've been discussing here in the introduction. And the interesting thing to me is that there was a lot of coverage of Vice President Harris right when she joined the administration. And she was quite prominent. And then for a while, she kind of receded from view, and we didn't really see or hear from her for a while. And then in October of this year, we got not one, but two major profiles of her that included interviews at major events around the world, traveling with her, and even in one case, visiting her in the residence, both from you and from Melania Plott at The Atlantic. And so I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit of the background of this piece. How did it come about? We got these two profiles at the same time. Was this a case where the office realized that they needed to start re-engaging with media? How exactly did you come to write the piece and get that access in the first place?
Well, I can't speak to what Elena and Atlantic's process was like, but I can speak to ours. And ours was driven by a desire to take a big swing at someone who I don't think has... I mean, my personal feeling is like, I covered her presidential campaign. And frankly, when they got to the office, I kind of gave it up mentally. I thought other people would cover her, move on. And I think from afar, I have been kind of frustrated with what I thought was a lack of ambition in the coverage around her. Like, I think that there has been a kind of lazy DC anonymous quotey vibe to the coverage around her that basically decided she wasn't quote unquote good enough in the open, but also not in the open, And I think that for me, as someone who can sometimes be frustrated with the kind of insidery Washington politics coverage, I thought that was like coalescing around a narrative before we had actually spoken some of these things out loud. And so, when we in the magazine's idea was really to just kind of go at it directly and say, okay, how much is the kind of political context around her? How much is her personally? How much is racism and sexism and kind of give her a chance to respond to this stuff directly. So that was kind of where we were working from. And it started really early in the year. I would say that I didn't get the access The Atlantic got. So I wasn't in the residence. I traveled to her at public events and traveled with the office for that. I went to Munich with her for the security conference, but I was in the public pool for Munich and had to do that to be able to see her. I traveled on Air Force Two, which is certainly the office helped with for go to certain campaign events, but it's not like I had particularly deep background access to that. It's not like I spent time with her in the home. I did have 45 minutes in an interview with her after an event in Chicago. And so my plan was basically to use that as a starting point, but it didn't really become that. It became kind of the sole kind of time I got with her for, I think, a number of reasons. And so basically I was in a position of what to do with that. It's helpful that I was someone who covered her before. I would say there was two sides of the coin. One, she knew me and we had kind of gone through a round of coverage during her presidential campaign. And that wasn't easy, right? That was not a presidential campaign that was particularly successful. And some of the stories we were writing at that time were particularly tough. But at the same time, I knew the cast of characters involved. And I kind of had a sense of what I thought was the missing gaps in the coverage. And so I think the process developed from me coming from a place of wanting to fill those gaps. But at the same time, I was really blue sky about this project. If they wanted me to follow her around in her house or wherever, I was open to doing that. I basically worked with what I got. And I think that's distinct from what The Atlantic did. And, to be honest, I knew that there were other profiles in the works, but that's not my concern. And so they posted, this is going to sound disingenuous, but they posted after us so I don't have any, I didn't think both of them were going to come out on the same day. I knew that they were working on something, and I knew that we were done. And so I knew ours was going up. And I, too, was surprised that they kind of both happened at the same time. But at the same time, that's kind of the nature of how this stuff kind of works. We wanted to make sure that our story was done in full and felt urgent, and it did. And so that was really my focus there. People often ask me, how did two big profiles come out on the same day? That's a question for them, honestly.
You specifically mentioned the DC nature of things, which I take as the palace intrigue. You mentioned, off the record sourcing. And I think that maybe VP Harris is unique in that, at least early on, I know there was a Washington Post profile, I guess you'd say, by Tyler Pager and another journalist who he spoke to about this. It was basically painted by anonymous former staffers. And a lot of these folks had very negative things to say about VP Harris, unlike other leading Democrats like President Obama, Biden, Speaker Pelosi. They never really suffered that. Even folks like former VP Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton, who experienced massive and vociferous criticism within their party, they still did not receive the kind of anonymous staffing. And when we get to VP Harris and these staff criticisms, it really reminds John and myself of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where he was defined a lot of the time by anonymous sources that were disgruntled former staff. So I guess the question for us is there something different about the way Harris treated staff?
Well, I would say a little bit of a lot of things. One is that there's clear a lack of loyalty throughout her history with former staff. And I think partially that is someone who has cycled through a lot of people. I think partially that's someone who hasn't had a long-term aide in the same way that Biden, of course, has staffed his White House with people he's been working with for decades, right? Like, for a lot of the people in these positions, it's not as if they don't have staff turnover. It's that the inner sanctum of that staff is usually around the same people. I think that's a big difference with Harris. It's not only that there's a lot of junior staff turnover, it's that there's not a lot of senior staff in place to keep the large-scale structures in line. I was talking to a member of Biden's White House and said, one question I have for him is like, what is the impact of that for you all? And what this person said, you can't always trust that the staff is speaking for the principal, right? If certain people speak for Joe Biden, they're speaking for Joe Biden, right? The impact of a kind of constant turnover of staff is that kind of trust is not necessarily there. But I guess I partially also I think the Harris kind of fans are right, that some of the anonymous stuff was backfilling people's own feelings about her outside of it. I really think, and I think the story says this is really about the presidential campaign, in my opinion. Like, there is a reputational sting that has lasted around her from having a disappointing presidential campaign. And so even when she was elevated to the role of vice president, there was a political ecosystem and media who was not treating her with a, I think, fresh look, partially because so much of what we saw in the presidential campaign did not live up to those expectations. So you couple that with the first year, with the Lester Holt interview, with the decision to kind of step back from doing kind of public things and kind of turn more inward as the story reports. And I think it adds up to people kind of saying what they want to say. And so one of the things that I think was important for me in this story was to put it to her and say, okay, if this is what folks are saying about you and their confidence in you leading the party, what do you say to that? Now, she chose not to really answer it. So that's a decision she can make. But what I wanted to do and what was important for me was that it wasn't going to go unasked and it wasn't going to go implied. Because I frankly think that the people who benefit from that not being explicit are the usual characters. I found that there's a lot of isms in that whisper network. And so one thing I wanted to do was I really trust myself to be a kind of fair adjudicator, but I don't want to be shadows. So if y'all want to if people want to imply diversity higher, let's talk about what that means. If people want to imply that there's not a worldview or no moderate progressive, we don't know where she falls, let's ask her, And so that was my premise.
You wanted to allow her to confirm or dispel these type of things on her own. in her own words, basically.
Yeah, and for people around them, to her too. And so I'm really proud of how many Black people, Black women, the story quotes. You know, this isn't a story that's built around people saying things who aren't invested in her. This story is built around people who are close to her and people and an ecosystem that has wanted her to see her succeed, in addition to dealing with the kind of larger Democratic whisper around her. Because I don't think that stuff is meaningless, right? If you're going to be the Democratic nominee, you need donors, right? You need people to really be excited about that leadership. So I don't think those anonymous quotes add up to nothing. I just don't want them to be add up to everything. And so I think that's what the story was trying to do.
And you do quote a number of Harris allies, one being the newly appointed senator, I believe, from California. As some of their quotes about the criticism that Harris has received is the criticism is quote unquote bullshit and quote unquote disrespectful. Those are two words that come up in your profile. And they even float some conspiracy theories that the Biden administration doesn't actually want VP Harris to succeed. So you've spoken to the VP, you've spoken to people in the Biden orbit, and you've spoken to these allies who went on the record having been in these conversations. Do these allies think that the negative media depiction of Harris is truly baseless and built entirely out of prejudice? Or is there something else going on?
Well, I think I think there's a structural thing and a specific thing. I think that there is a belief among allies that this is mostly Washington punishing someone who they don't think should be there. And that basically adds up to prejudice, that no matter how much you think she is bad, quote unquote, in DC terms, there's no way she's worse than a lot of people they treat a lot nicer. And that for those allies, they think that the source of it is a kind of humbling of a Black woman who even those in Democratic orbit do not believe should be there. I would say the nuanced take there, though, is that vice president isn't a role that creates a structure for someone to succeed. So there's the Jim Palmieri quote, who very much is someone who wants Vice President Harris to do well, saying this has gone exactly about how she expected it to go. Because it's not as if it's a job, I think the quote is, that's going to set her up to fail, but it's not a job that sets her up to succeed, right? And so that's the broader takeaway. It's not necessarily that the Biden campaign is sabotaging Harris, like, Latasha Brown says in the story, but that they're just not thinking that's not their job. Their job is to think about Joe Biden. And so that in doing that, it's not as if this is a person that has been set up to see. But I would say, like, my big experience is that all of that stuff is true, right? You could talk about staffers, you could talk about blah, blah, blah. But my biggest takeaway was that this is a person that does not want to do that themselves, right? There's a way that we expect politicians to define themselves in the public sphere and define what they believe in, and to stand on that. And I think that's a part of the vision that folks are looking for her to have. And that is not who she is. So when I am coming to her saying, what would the Harris version of the world look like? That's a premise she's not going to accept. So that's what I think was the work of the story, was showing people whether, if you're looking for that moment for her, it's not coming. Now, you can think that's a good thing. You can think that politicians say too many words, and actually you want someone who makes decisions and who gets things done and blah, blah. And I think that's her argument. But I think there's a lot of people who also want politicians to stand for a vision. And I think it's important to note that for a long time in her career, that's not something she had to do, right? The work of a prosecutor is reactive. The work of a prosecutor is accountability. The work of a prosecutor is not in setting forth a vision that everything else works in relation to. And so while she hasn't been one since 2016, and of course, in the meantime, she ran for president, her constitution politically is not in that. So that's what I wanted to show, to use the overdone Marco Rubio thing. Like, let's dispel with the notion of like who you think Kamala Harris might be, and let's actually deal with who she is.
It's interesting, Astead, what you're pointing at there, because when Justin and I were discussing the article as we were preparing for this, what we kept on saying was the big takeaway is exactly what you've just indicated, which is that she seems to be a person who has a high level of discomfort talking about herself, talking about her experiences, talking about her perspective, bragging. And it's interesting because this is a trait that many people have, but it's a particularly unfortunate trait for a politician, because that is so much of the job. And politicians, I'm thinking of Bill Clinton, people like that, Donald Trump, who are so excited to talk about themselves and how great they are and how they see the world. And Harris reminds me in a way of Mitt Romney, someone who was just like Harris, so incredibly accomplished in his prior career. But when he was on the campaign trail, he just did not want to talk about what he'd achieved, how he sees the world, who he is as a person, his family. And it makes it so difficult to campaign when you can't do that. Is this just the wrong career for someone like Vice President Harris?
I mean, it's hard to say that when they're a history maker, right? She's the first vice president who's a woman in human history, right? One thing I would say is we should be clear that I think it's a specifically gendered trait that politicians have. We're used to this being men, and we're used to that being a specific thing. Now, I would say I also covered Elizabeth Warren. I've also covered Amy Klobuchar. I think this is a specifically Kamala Harris quality to this degree, but I do think it's a gendered trait in general. I would also say I think you don't have to talk about yourself if people trust they know who you are, right? I don't think Hillary Clinton wanted to sit around and talk about herself all day. But I do think people had a sense of Hillary Clinton as wonk, as knowledgeable, as like you have like a trust in decision maker that's built up over time. But I think is really underrated. What I think Harris has as a difficulty is people don't know. It's still not been that long. Like as of the day before the 2016 election, she was supposed to have 6 years in the Senate. That first term would have ended last year, right? And in that time, she has run for president, dropped out of presidency, and become vice president, a role that's not really about yourself. I would also say Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, was really uncomfortable with being placed in a box of Black woman, or any identity box, to be honest, but really didn't like that. And I think there's a way that prosecutor allows you to exist outside of that, because it's just about what you're doing. People called her the female Obama, but it wasn't a thing she had to put on herself, right? When you get to kind of electoral legislative office, that even in the way she talks, she still kind of demeans legislative work. She says, I'm not here to make speeches. I'm not here to do that. And I think that's still a muscle memory from a different time, but there's also now a different expectation. Part of the work of the story was showing that in the presidential campaign, what I think is even more important than almost anything else is that she avoided the issue that her career speaks the most to. She did not want to be the voice on criminal justice, partially because the way the party's language had changed and how much that would require her to talk about her own changes in her record. If the presidential campaign of Kamala Harris is not going to talk about criminal justice first and foremost, what do you have to really understand her as an arc? You get what I'm saying? And so that is why I think the kind of identity piece is important, because this is also someone who's become increasingly untethered from the policy issue that her career spoke the most to, and more put in the box of a thing she's actually uncomfortable with, which, as all people are, being comfortable being reduced to their identity, right? Like, she doesn't want to be the only known or specifically known as the Black woman VP. But those identity boxes can be harder to transcend, specifically when there's not a policy area that's allowing you to be more than that.
You know, this is a lot of what we were talking about as we were preparing for this. And this is also part of why I made the comparison to Mitt Romney, because it's this idea of running away from your own career and not wanting to talk about your background.
Well, the world had changed. In the same way, by the time Mitt Romney had become the nominee, Republicans were careening towards their Donald Trump populism, right? Like, quote unquote populism. So I'm saying Bain Capital was out, you know? And so I'm saying it's a similar thing that by the time you actually arrive to your moment, the way Democrats talk about criminal justice was not necessarily the Kamala Harris career of criminal justice. I think you can tell a story of change that people identify with. But if you're not going to do that, that becomes the problem.
I mean, you know, you've had a great career and you've accomplished something, and that's what you should be talking about. But you let the other side define that experience, and you don't build an alternative narrative. So, you know, you work in a renowned company and you implement major healthcare reform in your state, but you don't want to talk about those things. You serve as a prosecutor. You don't want to talk about that. You're the first woman to become vice president. You would be the first religious minority to become president in the case of Romney. Don't want to talk about that. Don't want to talk about my personal background. It just makes it harder.
And I think this is an age, I would say even more so than Romney. I think Trump changed a lot of this. I think there is a desire for authenticity in politicians that really causes voters to smell some of this out, right? Like, and for Joe Biden's, political shortcomings, he is an authentic person. Like, it's not like, he got in trouble, like he has had to litigate himself publicly for a very long time. And so I think particularly now, and I think this is actually, I would say, true of the 2020 field of Democrats largely, I think the people who were at the position to run for office at that point were not necessarily the crop of people whose careers had led them to the authenticity that was required for that point. And so I think it actually lends itself to someone like Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders also. I don't think it's an accident that the people who came out of this are people who have been who they were the whole time.
Because they're juxtaposed against the crop that you just mentioned. It makes total sense.
Yeah, and I think the crop was having to catch up. I think the world had changed. Democratic politics had changed a lot really fast. And so if you're not Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden, everyone else in that race was having to recalibrate.
Being true to herself in the case of Vice President Harris means really being a prosecutor. We remember her best moments from her short Senate career were when she was interrogating nominees. She approached the interviews with you, Astead, similarly in a way that's surprising and jarring and makes reading the article a really strange and entertaining experience, because you've been talking just now about how she has these problems of perception that she is surely aware of, things that she has to overcome. And you, in your approach to the story, wanted to give her the opportunity to do that. And so you asked her very direct questions about the issues that surround her and her office. And I think they were exactly the questions that you would have expected to prepare for as you were approaching this kind of interview for her and her staff. But she seemed surprised and defensive when she was asked these questions that she could have anticipated, that were giving her the opportunity to address these topics. What was she expecting to get out of the interview, if not that? It's very strange. She answers a question instead with a question back in prosecutor mode.
Listen, like, I was in shock as this was happening. So not because I didn't know I've gone through this process with her a little before. I've interviewed her before. I know she pushes back. I know all of that stuff. But the degree to which she felt defensive about some of those questions, I was surprised by. But I would also say I'm okay with people shooting down the premise. Like, you don't have to agree with the premise of a question. The thing that I think, like, comes through with her is, like, some people like prosecutor versions of politicians, but prosecutor is not a balanced playing field, right? It's one that comes with an implicit power, right? Like, you're kind of talking at someone more so than you're talking with someone. And particularly in the audio version of the interview that played on our podcast, a lot of our responses were people who I think are used to politicians who take those as opportunities for connection, right? And that's not really her instinct. I think that there is a world where someone can own that, as she was somewhat doing in an interview and trying to say, that's not who I am, this is who I am. But I also think there's a lot of voters and people who that's who they expect politicians to be. I was thinking that I was asking questions not because I had them, but because everyone has them. The questions around her are both in the air but unsaid. I say it, she shot it down, and that is what it is. It's important to me that people hear that as a decision she made. There's still value in that. I think you come out of the story thinking, all right, well, she's not going to answer it. She's not going to do it. I think people are saying, has she not had the opportunity to? Why is there a perception that she doesn't want to speak to this or define herself? And I think one thing that I kept in those extended interactions of the piece is you hear that it's her choice.
So our audience knows this. I am a paid hack, Astead. 2016, I was working in media for the RNC, became a Democrat, so worked in policy and in communications. And reading this from a staffer's perspective or former staffer's perspective, I was dumbfounded. I was yelling as I was reading because the question of that John asks is, this is a profile, what type of questions was she expecting? And then the questions you were asking, John and I discussed this, was in the parlance of voters. One of the questions is, how would you define yourself on a moderate, progressive?
And yeah, I wasn't trying to make it like a Politico insidery thing. I'm saying, okay, let me take the perspective of someone who is just wants to get to know you. There's a lot of politicians who would see that as an opportunity.
Yeah.
But that's not the vice president. I don't know what to say. Like, that's just not who she is.
Yeah, no, okay. So I guess why? And this is asking for speculation, but like from the staffer's perspective, she's had to have been briefed on this
I don't think this was an unprepared person.
Okay.
I don't think I can say from our process or from how I work as a journalist, I think nobody in that room was confused about what I was going to ask. I think she doesn't want to answer. I don't know if it's me. I don't know if it's someone else says that questions it's different, but I don't really think so. I don't know if I should say this out loud, but like if I were to take the full good faith version of what one could say from her perspective, I think there is a sense this journalist is working from a premise that something is not working out. And I'm the vice president. You know, some of it is, I think, someone who feels like, why am I being forced to defend myself when I have succeeded? I think there's a lot of definitions of political success, right? And I think there's a lot of definitions of what people want from their leaders. And I think that someone can be in a position of power and still earn to be pushed, right? Like I'm saying, I do think there is some of that involved. It's like, why are you acting like I failed when I haven't?
Well, and it is a point important to note, though, that the voters didn't make her the VP. It wasn't some massive electoral success that made her the VP.
Nor were the questions from a presumption of failure. I don't agree with that because I don't think that's what the questions were, nor do I think that is but I'm saying, if you're asking why, that would be my answer to why.
You know, I wonder if there's actually an interesting mirror image dynamic between President Biden and Vice President Harris in this regard, where President Biden, as far as we continue hearing, really wants to be out with the press, talking, answering questions, and his staff are reluctant to put him in that position and have continued to try to rein him in, keep him protected from that environment. And then the case of Harris, her staff are putting her forward for major interviews and profiles, and understand that there's a problem where she's not as visible as perhaps she should be. And she does not want to participate in this process.
And even more so, after the Lester Holt interview, our reporting is that people were encouraging her to stay out, and it was her decision to really pull back from a kind of public eye. So I definitely think that there is a difference in perspective, but there's a difference in those people, right? Joe Biden thrives among kind of like general interaction to the point where there need to pull him back from that instinct, right? But he also thrives as a kind of unprompted person, right? Like I would always say to people, like, if you gave me the 2020 field and just like threw them in my dad's church in Chicago, like who would I think all of those people would like the most? Like Joe Biden, without question, right? Like, and not because he's Joe Biden, but because I've seen him do the rooms. He's very good at it, right? I do think there is a natural comfort, uncomfort feeling, but at the same time, I don't want to understate that there's a self-fulfilling loop to this. Having done the Times' Harris and Warren coverage in 20, you could feel how, campaigns, specifically women, would feel targeted, would then be less willing to be open, and then that would only cause more stories to happen. I would like to think that I gave ample opportunity for something different. And I would like to think that if it was a me thing, we would see a different version of Vice President Harris somewhere else. And we don't. Come next year, that dynamic is going to be a real tension point. Do they want Joe Biden out everywhere when the sight of him reminds people of his biggest liability, his age, right? And then at the same time, in the absence of him out there, do they have a messenger that can shore up the coalitions they need in Vice President Harris? We don't know.
Yeah, and I was watching the debate last night. For our listeners that probably weren't watching, a debate between Governors Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis. And it was funny, and these were Fox News pundits, but I believe one of them said Gavin Newsom should be signed up by the Biden campaign to be their top surrogate. Now, that was not my takeaway from the debate. I do not think he rings of authenticity, which is something that is very important that you mentioned, said earlier. But looking forward to 2024, looking forward to who could be a prominent surrogate for the president, what role do you think VP Harris wants to play in the coming campaign?
It's not only what role does she want to play, it's what role must she have. I mean, the campaign is very clear that she will be the top surrogate for the campaign. She has to be, partially because they need to reverse people's uncomfort with her as Biden's possible successor, or in the event of emergency. They wave away some of the Harris concerns as overblown, but they are not unaware of them. And so you're going to see her as the foremost surrogate to young people, specifically on gun control, to on abortion rights, on like education. I saw her in Orlando when she really pushed back against, the Governor DeSantis, like slavery had some benefits thing, right? That's where they plan to deploy her, as the person to shore up the base. That's not a small thing, though. Like, Joe Biden is doing pretty fine among swing voters and independents. The mass worry via the polls is because of said base. And so it both has a high ceiling for them to make up, right? And if young people and Black folks and all these folks come home, then certainly the bedwetting that we see right now probably lessens. But it's not clear to me that is an easy thing for them to do. And they are resting a big portion of that on Vice President Harris. And so I definitely think we are going to get some interesting, nuanced, maybe uncomfortable answers about even her own relationship with Black voters, about even her relationship with young people or suburban women or the rest. And if that is the person they trust to make that pitch to those communities, that is not a small part of their reelection. That is a big part of their reelection.
Do you think she's going to be comfortable in this role? Now, it's not talking about her. It's talking about her team and President Biden, and there's a different approach.
I mean, I've seen her really kill it in rooms, too. It's not, I don't think it's one story. And I also think there's different slices of these electorates. If we're talking about the type of people who don't typically vote, the kind of marginal Black voters they need, that's a different type of people than if she is really getting an organizing network going, right? There's been moments even on her, she did a tour of colleges this fall that have had big crowds and big standing ovations. I just think that has not been consistent. If you were to think about someone who's going to be the next president or is going to be the next leader of the party, you would expect that to be overwhelming. We're talking about Democrats. If the bar you want to hold is this person ready to step in and lead the party, then coalescing Democrats is step one.
I suppose one of the narratives that we're kind of addressing here is the sense that the Democratic Party are increasingly unconfident in Harris as a leader of the party, as someone who's playing an active role in the administration. And something that I noticed, I'm not sure how many other people noticed this, but when Harris and Biden came into office in 2021 and during the transition, there were a lot of references to the Biden-Harris administration. All of the nominations, they would say this person was nominated to serve the Biden-Harris administration as ambassador to Luxembourg, and so on. I've seen less and less of that. At some point, it stopped, and it only became references to the Biden administration, no Biden-Harris administration. Are we able to pinpoint the moment in which that happened? Because it was 100% to zero. And at some point, they stopped using Biden-Harris administration.
I tried to look into this. They've actually started redoing it more in the campaign season. So I think it went Biden-Harris to doing it again. She was featured 13 times in the reelection announcement. That is because of that intention. Now, they make a specific point to blast out her events, to push back against stuff she gets online. All that ticket replacement talk is pure fantasy. Their strategy is to defend her robustly. And they think if she is an ambassador for the Biden agenda, that is a working message. I remember it kind of dying out, but I think it's been intentionally brought back, partially because of their challenges.
Look, this is going to be a close election no matter how many candidates are on the board or who we're running against. Our campaign does not, subscribe to the notion that it's going to be Donald Trump. We're building a campaign and an infrastructure that's going to be able to compete against anyone. But look, this campaign is going to be close, as I said, and what we focused on is what we can control, and that's communicating to American voters. And so, again, we're spending the resources that we've been able to raise to make sure that we're communicating our message and doing it in sophisticated ways that haven't been done before, and we're very proud of that. So, again, it's something that we're monitoring and paying attention to, but, we're focused on delivering our message.
So I want to switch a little bit more into focus on 2024. When you're campaigning, there's the breakdown between emotional and logical. So like policy arguments, right? And in your interview with Mr. Folks, he outlines, 3 core foundational issues for the campaign to focus on. The first being the accomplishments of the Biden administration, which you would assume would be legislative or things like withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. But you also mentioned that Biden's doing pretty well with voters that you need to persuade. And it's the base where they need to increase energy to turn these folks out. They don't maybe feel the impacts of the IRA or the bipartisan infrastructure deal. They're certainly not aware of the policy intricacies of these pieces of legislation. Heck, the implementation of them may take a decade for these pieces of legislation to be truly felt.
Well, they're just going to try to connect those dots. They think that people may not necessarily feel IRA or infrastructure, but they're going to spend a lot of money to try to change that. I think their other thought is that the choice between Biden and the Republican and maybe Trump has not become clear for people yet. And that when it is Biden versus Republican, they will look a lot better than when it is Biden, how do you feel about him? And so basically, it's not as if they think the qualms people are saying right now are invalid. They think that come next November, it will not be top of mind because the choice will drive decisions, and also they'll have enough time and enough money to make the impact of first administration more tangible for people. Now, that's what they say. I mean, I believe them. I just think that a lot of our work is about whether it's not a message problem, but a messenger problem. Maybe people do think Joe Biden, as people we talk to all the time, has been a fine president, but they're actually worried about the future. That's why I think it's the uniqueness of his challenge of age is that it's not actually about some shortcoming. It's just the fact. And so, I think they're going to do all of those things. And I think those things are a good plan. And I don't think it's a Biden campaign that is seeing these polls and saying they don't matter. I think they're seeing these and believing they're putting enough money in them to change it eventually. And believing by the time people tune in to the choice of next year's election, they're going to be running against a criminally convicted felon. And they'll take those odds.
Sounds like it would be helpful to have a prosecutor on your team to negatively define that candidate that you're running against.
You would think. So I'm saying, there's a lot. If you take the individual of Kamala Harris out of it, the paper still makes sense. The prosecutor, someone who has represented both tough on crime and reform. Someone who obviously has a background that speaks to the diversity of the country. Someone who's from San Francisco, a virtual ATM for Democratic politicians. You would think the paper still makes sense. And from kind of reporting, I don't know how much the paper is worth, but I do think that's the reason to not be too definitional about all this stuff is because there's a reason she's there in the first place.
I think what you just mentioned brings to mind something that was really on my mind as I was reading the piece, because the piece really gets into this question of, is Vice President Harris the highest ranked identity hire in the country? And I think that there is a sense that today and in this election cycle, emphasis on identity and representation, it seems to have less currency than it did in the last election. And that there's a little bit less of a focus on personal characteristics as we talk about candidates, not just candidates, but also other issues in the news. I'm wondering, is that something that you've noticed as well, that the resonance of personal characteristics and identity are carrying less weight today? And do you think that this is something on the mind of the campaign and Vice President Harris herself?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I personally think it's carrying less weight, but I think in general, we should be more honest about who it carried weight to originally. Like the pledge, the part of the reason I make the diversity thing clear is the pledge is Joe Biden's choice to put her in that box, right? Like the person who made the decision to say they were going to choose a woman that then kicked off this like identity fight was Biden, because he wanted to centralize votes to coalesce the primary at the right time. I think we need to remember the person who makes the pledge before LaFonza Butler's chosen in the Senate is Gavin Newsom, who wants to wiggle out of I mean, they're usually white men at these pledges who are using them for their own political gain. And so part of the reason I wanted to name it specifically is to take it off of her personally, right? Like the choice to put someone in a box was not hers. And I think that's important to remember. I also think they are having less resonance. And I remember doing a story in 2020 about how when I would be in South Carolina and people would do their kind of identity race stuff, it would kind of be crickets. And when I was in Iowa and they would do it, it would be mass applause. Like these were largely for white liberals from the jump anyway. And so I think that that's important, right? Is to be like, it's not as if I think Black voters care less about race or cared more then. I think the care has always been there and remains there. But really the backlash is to a certain expression that was never driven by a lot of those base voters in the first place, you know? And so that's a complicated way for me to agree with your premise, to say, I do think it's changing. And I do think there's less emphasis on insert personal characteristic. But I will also say, I would bet Donald Trump's VP is definitely not a white man. No way. I mean, they're still thinking about identity a lot.
They think about identity more, I would argue, in a different way.
Yeah, I would say Republicans, I think Trump specifically wields identity in a different way, but I would say Democrats too. But I think Democrats learned some lessons in 2020 because they were listening to a very specific group of people about what those expressions had to look like, right? So like you get, and I'm not really talking even defund. I'm talking like the picture at the Capitol of them in kente cloth and kneeling, right? Like I'm talking about some of the ways representation worked that I just don't think hit for a younger generation of people of color who have seen Black politicians be part of systems they don't like, right? Like, or have seen, it's just a different relationship, right? Go to Atlanta, a place that's had Black mayors for years, and you're going to get a different response about whether a person in power inherently means something different, right? And I think some of that is happening in the country broadly, is that there was so much emphasis for Democrats that if a person is at the table, that means something. And I think for a lot of people, it does. And I don't want to say that it doesn't still, but I want to say that for a younger generation of people, it increasingly means less.
I remember watching the 2020 Republican National Convention, and they were talking about identity issues all the time and diversity all the time throughout their convention. And it's sometimes in language that was really not that different from the way that Democrats talk about it. It was kind of the spirit of the cycle. And I think your observations there are fascinating about what was really driving that and what wasn't.
Yeah, I just think all the time we assume people are talking about race for non-white people. And I'm like, why is that assumption happening? Because on the trail, I could see the difference in reaction. Like, it's not as if they didn't care. But you know, I got sent down to do this, like the same version of like the South Carolina, they're ditching Joe Biden for this story 100 times. And I'm like, that's not how folks think always, you know? Like if race is always there, it's also not there always, and there's a way that particularly for a certain type of liberal in that time, that expression of racial value was more important for white Democrats, in my opinion.
Well, I think your comment about the need to kind of investigate the actual thoughts and sentiments of mainstream Democratic voters is an interesting one. And it brings to mind another piece that you worked on that I wanted to get a chance to ask you about, because we have, I think, seen this pattern of the redneck safaris that have become a little bit reviled because of how common they are, that coastal media networks and
I love a safari. I'm very pro safari. I just think you can do them well, but I'm pro safari.
But the funny thing is that they seem like they were obsessively focused on the Republican voters. All of the safaris were to Youngstown, Ohio, and places like this. And there wasn't the same kind of curiosity about the mainstream-based Democratic voter. People go to diners to meet Republicans. They don't go to diners or barbershops or bowling alleys or sporting events to meet the average Democratic voter and ask what they're thinking. And that was something that you actually did, Astead, which I think we all applaud because it's a clear gap. You went to this bellwether county in Washington State to find out what the people there were thinking. And I think your conclusion at the end of kind of the profile was that the county was likely to vote for Biden. And so you met a lot of Biden voters in diners, a remarkable thing. So what did you learn about these voters that everyone else is missing, that no one's learning or assuming?
Yeah, we were trying to take the gimmick directly. I mean, the fact is that there's only one county in the country that has gotten the presidential race correctly every year since 1980. And so I was like, that's kind of fun. And decided to just actually do a day at a diner there. And the important part is like, I have always felt like with the so-called safari stories, like as long as you're not doing them on their own, right? This should match up with data. This should match up with what we are seeing kind of in national trends. And this should be like a way to explore a broader topic, not like I talked to 12 people and thus they are the world. And so like for us, it was really clear that like, one, it wasn't just that we were in this county. It's that what we were hearing in this county matched up with what we see broadly, which is that more independent and swingy folks are thinking about Democrats, right? Like are thinking that the Republicans are looking kind of crazy right now, like are feeling that Donald Trump has lost them. And so we talked to people in this place. And we also talked to Trump supporters, but we felt that like we were about to dig into a primary that was going to be so Trump voter focused that let's actually deal with what this county is for, which is the bellwetherness. And, I really like that, like, you listen to that episode, the elections happened on the week after, and it matches up. I think that you shouldn't try to overprescribe the mood that you get, but I think that when you do it well, it shouldn't be out of line with what the national trend is. And so that was really our goal, was to hear from a diversity of people. But it was past just Trump or Biden. We have people who are more checked out of politics, people who are more scared about next year, people who feel that like a sense of shock that it even could be Trump versus Biden again. And so those were the emotions that we were trying to start with. So there'll be time to get to the kind of horse racy thing, but we really saw that county as a bellwether for the mood. And I think a lot of people's mood when it comes to the prospect of a rematch is simply like they're perplexed to the point that it becomes an indictment of the system, right? Something that someone said to me that stuck with me is if that's who the parties are presenting us with again, then the only problem is the parties. They're so confident that the country does not want that again. Then what is it about the system that's not producing that result? And so that's the thing that I really love about that episode and what sticks with me. There's such an assumed language of political insiders that says, oh, since we know this is going to happen, we're just taking it on its face. And I wanted to slow that down and be like, one, the majority of the country is shocked that this is happening again. And two, doesn't want it to. Now, does that mean that they're not going to vote? Does it mean Joe Biden's going to lose? No. But that means that actually there's a broader story besides just who wins about Americans' relationship with politics itself. And I think that's going to be a huge story next year. I don't know how that's going to affect the result. Like, does that mean people stay home? Does that mean there's third-party candidates? Does that mean people, does that make them more likely for violence? Does that mean, I don't know what that means. But I do think that what the underrated thing about next year's election that the parties and kind of insiders, in my opinion, are missing is that I don't think the country's just going to sit and take it. I don't think they're just going to eat shit on candidates they don't want. I think there's going to be some clear expression of distaste. And I think parties are underrating that.
No, it's a powerful answer. To bring some levity to it, I just blame Gen X because they're not capable of breaking through and actually taking leadership when it's their turn.
Hey, that's a fair point. We're going to go from boomers to a millennial president, probably. And like
Biden's not even a boomer. He's the silent generation. He was born before the Second World War.
So it is kind of like, you have one job here, Gen X, and you can't follow through.
So we're wrapping up here, but Astead, I think one of the first answers you gave really hit me hard, and we don't normally ask silly or as broad questions as this, but you were explaining your justification or your reasoning or your impetus to go and do a profile with the VP. And it wasn't just that she was a powerful person. There was legitimate reasoning behind it, filling the gaps. So if you could choose to do a profile on somebody else that is living, not Jesus or whatever the politicians say, who would it be? And specifically, and maybe more interesting to me is, why would you choose to do a profile on that person? What's missing from their public persona?
Oh, I mean, it would be Donald Trump, but it would be in the Trump way I don't cover. Like, I do Trump grassroots, and I would be curious to see Trump from the inside. I think, he's the one person in which palace intrigue actually matters because it's how he makes decisions. So I've done a lot of Trump rally things, but I've never done a top-down thing. And I don't think I'm going to, they don't provide that type of access or whatever. But if I could, if you're just asking blue sky, if I could fly with him to an indictment, I would totally do that. If I could have a day at Bedminster. I just think that the type of people he surrounds himself with to see those moments are the type of people you don't trust as narrators of those moments. So I think, there's Maggie, there's Jonathan, there's people who can recreate them in good ways. But if they were giving up access in a profile way, I would love to see it firsthand.
There's a movie about this, about how palace intrigue matters. The Favorite with Olivia Colman. Queen Anne is having affairs with two of her companions, played by Rachel Weisz and Emma Stone. And whoever is her preferred companion on a given day determines whether England is at war with France. And it's sad. And that's what Trump's presidency was like.
Yeah, and so that's really how I feel. It's it's not the genre of political reporting I do, but it's not a genre I would throw out, particularly with Donald Trump, is because I do think that that's someone who makes such decisions based on that stuff. I would love to see it. Think back to Jonathan Swan's Trump interview. I often deal with politicians who will not tell me an answer. And that's my challenge. Donald Trump kind of will. And so you have a separate challenge, right? Of how and why and what you're trying to get. And that would be a new challenge. And so that would be my interest, even though it's a very obvious answer.